When I was 20, I took a job to earn pocket money while making up for my earlier underachievements at the local community college. My new employer was one of those full service residential cleaning companies. I won't say which one, so to protect the innocent. Let's just call it Clean Bro. I was one of those two types of people who worked for the mops of for Clean Bro, 20-year-old punks who hadn't spent high school at the bottom of the bong, like myself, and 40-year-old losers who don't care how dirty they got during the day, so as long as they can afford to wash themselves off in a cheap beer that night. There were also plenty of upscaling folks in the profession, but they all tended to have a sign of the companies that cared more about their employees, work ethic, and less about the kind of documentation that comes standard with being born here. Unlike the competition, Clean Bro exclusively hired dropouts and burnouts only because we worked for the peanuts, and because corporate seems to have a knack for attracting government scrunty. For both groups, then, clean up for other people's messes was something to do while running away from our own. Anyone come to the job from somewhere else is less than ideal, and most folks left it for pastures and were no greener. Cleanup jobs came in a pretty wide variety. The most common one was picking up after the kitchen fire. Some sleep-deprived stay-at-home mom would put dinner on the stove and nod off onto the couch. The smoke alarm would then blare and give the kids a good fright, but everybody would make it out safe. The fire department would hose it all down with gray water, leaving behind a colossal mess of smoke-stained ceilings, waterlogged drywall, shattering drinking glasses, and smashed dishware. Once the claims adjuster had taken his look, the homeowner would call Clean Bro, and I would roll up in my company van and the company overalls to spend the day scrubbing soot off the windows, prying up the crackled tile, and sucking ashes into the world's most powerful shop vac. The next day, the carpenters would swoop in and put the whole thing back together better than new. With the insurance payout, half of these houses had a nicer kitchens by all the time was said and done. I had usually got a pretty good tip for my trouble. Some of the cleaners refused to work anything worse than a fire rehab or food restoration. But as a young fellow, I liked to think I could stomach anything. So I ended up taking a lot out of the worst jobs, too. For example, every couple of weeks, Clean Bro got called to work on a death scene. Now, it's not as bad as you think. By the time I pulled up the van, the coroner had picked up the body and the cops had asked their questions, and Forsyth's team scraped together whatever evidence they were going to. At that point, the homeowner was usually left with a little more than with some bad memories and a stain, and it was my job to scrub out the stain. The more considerate ones hardly left any mess at all, choosing the bathtub for their final resting place before cutting off their wrists or swallowing handfuls of pills. Sometimes there would be a dark ring revealing the tub's last high water mark, but usually there would be no sign at it at all of what happened here. Still, the homeowner would normally have to pull out the tub entirely, leaving behind a hole that they would fill with something new. I guess they didn't like the idea of taking a shower or bath in that same place where a loved one lay dead, decaying for hours, days, maybe even weeks before being discovered. They hired me in my area because a lot of the regular contractors can't touch a tub that had a dead body in it, owing to the occupational health regulations. But as a Clean Bro cleaner, I had all the necessary training and safety gear to touch dirty things. Some of the dead were less polite though, folks who weren't in bed, which included a lot of elderly types of taking the natural way out, left behind a pretty big mess on the sheets and mattresses from the various liquids that tend to exit the body upon death. Blood and vomit were pretty common in additions from the cutters and overdosers, respectively. The cleanup was involved a little more than wrapping everything in plastic and hollowing out for a proper biohazardous waste disposal. At service, Clean Bro provided for a reasonable fee. Then there were the really rude people. The ones who decided to swallow a bullet because it's quick, they tended to take the longest mop up. I'll spare you the details beyond that. Worse than the mess itself was a 1,000-yard stare on that face of the spouse or parent who had the misfortune of discovering the body and seeing their loved one in that state. You just knew those people would never be there the same beside again. Now, if all that makes you reconsider your professional choices for a career in cleanup duty, perhaps you'll think again when I tell you this tale. I had been working at Cleanbro for about a year when I got sent on a job early one morning. My boss didn't give me any details, just the address and the work order phrase, basement deep clean, telling me someone would explain it to me when I got there. Vague instructions were always a bad sign. I packed up one of the boxy Cleanbro vans with the full set gear, then headed out. The place was hard to find, tucked off back road in the woods at the edge of town, and the satellite navigation was barely a thing yet, let alone GPS-enabled smartphones. After making a few wrong turns, I figured I was in the right place when I spotted one of my fellow cleaners, Kurt, waiting in the driveway by his beater Civic. It wasn't unusual for folks to get called in straight from home to work onto a rush job on their day off. Kurt was the other kind of Cleanbro cleaner, the 40-year-old burnout. Fortunately, he was a reasonable, reliable, preferring to stay sober at least until the job was nearly done. He was smoking a cigarette while some slick 30-something in a suit, holding a binder, was shouting and waving excitedly at him. I recognized the guy, a real estate agent for a local bank often hired by Cleanbro to make the foreclosures presentable before putting them up on the market. Those jobs were some of the worst, even though there was rarely any blood or gore. Instead, we had to deal with the knee-deep residue of evicted horrors, or work without lights and running water, where the drug addicts had ripped out wires and plumbing to sell for scrap. At risk getting shot by a disgruntled ex-homeowner, looking to exact revenge on whatever poor schmuck was standing on his property at the behest of that fucking bank. I was almost relieved when I recognized the house as a different case entirely. About 6 months earlier, it came to light that a bunch of disappearances throughout the state had been a work of some local psycho who was using his basement at the EscapeAuteur. At the evening news had run a shot off the killer's house to introduce to a couple of weeks' nightly updates on the story. Such a normal fellow. His neighbors had to hold the cameras, so clean, they said. I had been with the Cleanbro for a few months at a time, and reports had made me wonder if I had learned enough about removing stains to make a murder case scene vanish completely. But by now I was a pro. Maybe this wouldn't be such a big job after all. Besides, they already found the guy hanging from his basement ceiling, so at least there were no chances of being the next unlucky contestant in this game. The cops had gotten a break in the case when a student at the college dodged an attempted kidnapping. They released a pretty good sketch to kick off a statewide manhunt. The police had gotten some leads in the area. Convenience store clerks whose stories were backed up by grainy security video. They started canvassing the area. Someone had found the front door standing open. Nobody at home, and I imagine they started peering through the windows until they spotted some probable cause. Once they realized what they had stumbled across, the cops must have figured out their suspect opted for the literal noose over the figurative one that is drawing tight around him. The real estate agent spun around, and when he heard my van pulling up the secluded driveway, and flashed a look of relief before turning red and again in agitation. He was already yelling at me before I had the van parked, squeezed between Kurt's Civic and a silver coupe that screamed self-indulgent prick. I calmly stepped out, walked to the back of the van, and began unloading the gear while he bavered me with something about having booked us weeks ago. Something about an open house in 2 days. Something about lawsuits. And something about hard-working, red-blooded Americans instead of lazy goddamn immigrants. Got here as soon as I was called, sir. We'll work as quickly as we can, pal. Way above my pay grade. Guy, go fuck yourself, I didn't say. The real estate asshole led me, Kurt, and our gear up to the missionary exterior steps, through the front door, down a hall, and into the kitchen where the entrance to the basement was. He tried the knob, which turned, but of course the door was stuck. I could tell the guy didn't really want to be here, and I couldn't wait to see him go. So I was about to volunteer when Kurt spoke up. "Let me see if I can open that for you, sir," he said. In that way of lifelong service slob like Kurt would literally be respectful while implying the deepest loathing imaginable. The agent seemed inordinately relieved as he stepped back all the way to the entrance of the kitchen, as if ready to sprint back to his Audi. I instinctively braced myself as Kurt gave me the door a single sharp shove in just the right spot, popping it free and releasing it to the most unholy smell imaginable. I reeled backwards, my eyes watering, my stomach and my throat fighting over which direction my half-digested breakfast was meant to go. I kept it down and blinked away tears as I heard Kurt wheezing for a breath through his tobacco-stained lungs. For a moment I envied his burnt-out sinuses, since he seemed barely only phased while I was on the verge of passing out. Before I could fully recover, I heard the agent snap that we had to be out by tomorrow at 10, in time for the house stagers' invite to arrive, turn to the basement crisp pit into a cozy game room or some shit. And then, with the audible bark of the 4 turbocharged cylinders, the real estate asshole was gone. Kurt and I put on our masks, which helped enormously with the smell. The HEPA filters pulled anything biohazardous out of the air, though you could still tell something had died down here. I descended down the narrow basement steps and found a pull chain dangling from the ceiling. I gave it a tug and was disappointed with how little effect it did. The killer had apparently decided to do this part to save the earth by installing one of those few helical compact fluorescent light bulbs, the kind that take a while to warm up. In its weak greenish light, combined with the dim morning sun filtering the row of 6-inch high basement windows, the room looked like pretty remarkable basement, a gray concrete rectangle with a few round steel posts supporting the joists above. Kurt awkwardly passed a heavy lighting rig down the stairs to me, and I plugged it into the outlet on the wall, pumping 200 watts into the halogen glory into that concrete room. I immediately wished that I hadn't. Under the dim fluorescent light, the floor had just been a gray plane, and it had a room full of shapeless gray furniture. Our artificial sun had revealed that I was, in fact, standing on a pool of dry blood that was nearly the size of the house's entire foundation, and there were tables and power tools around, anything too big to fit in the evidence bag, that were equally coated in what I could only guess were tiny bits of human remains. Again, I'll spare you the details. Suffice it to say, I was glad we had full-body plastic suits to wear for this kind of job. "Takes a long time to make a mess this big," Kurt muttered as he reached for the bottom of the stairs and turned slowly to take in the view. Kurt and I got to work, and after a while I barely even noticed the noxious smell leaking through my mask. We laid out drop cloths to avoid tracking gore around. We wrapped the soiled furniture and tools in plastic to haul away when we found the bulkhead door up to the backyard. But it was padlocked shut, so we broke our backs by pulling the things up the narrow steps to the kitchen, looking like a germophobic movers as we emptied the basement into the front lawn. The day wore on and we took our lunch break. A Clean Bro disposal truck stopped by to pick up the large bio-contaminated debris. The driver was a friend and had picked up some subs for us on our way out. Kurt scarfed down the bologna and American cheese on white, but I didn't have much of an appetite for my chicken parm. When he had finished eating, Kurt had a Marlboro Red from his bright orange Zippo and was surprisingly cheerful mood despite this being far the nastiest call I've ever worked. He told me all about his less than illustrious career in cleanup, on how he had been cleaning for 20 years and worn the overalls for half as many different companies throughout the region. A note of nostalgia in his voice, making the biggest mess disappear, gave him a kind of satisfaction that I, at the time, couldn't quite muster. I must have never seen Kurt so chatty, but I was content to let him talk to himself out of returning to the task at hand. We hit things hard after that, hoping to finish our job without having to come back as early the next morning to make our deadline. Our boss at Clean Bro always showed appreciation when we made our bank clients happy. They had offered plenty of the toughest but most incredible jobs. All the big stuff was out, and the layers of caked-on blood was starting to wear away under the industrial solvents we had deployed. Between operating the basement windows and setting up the massive industrial fan blowing down from the top of the steps, we'd managed to clear the worst of the fumes. Mopping away was sweating the works of the full hoods and masks, and I was starting to feel weak from skipping lunch, so we decided to take them off and risk the air. The smell was now entirely tolerable, although I did catch the occasional whiff of death in the afternoon wore on. The sun was setting as we started to wrap things up. Thanks to the chemistry mops and the old-fashioned elbow grease, the concrete floor was clean enough that you could eat off of it, assuming you had no idea about the horrible crimes that had been committed here. Anything else just been soiled by either off the property or in the back of the van. Kurt and I nodded in agreement at a job well done, and then, just as I turned to haul the first load of cleaning equipment back up the narrow basement steps, I heard a sharp pop above my head. I had clipped the fluorescent light bulb with a mop handle, shattering it into fine silver powder that drifted down like snow, working it under the glow of our industrial lamps. I had completely forgotten it was there. Now, as if there weren't enough reasons to hate these fucking compact fluorescent bulbs, these damn things have mercury in them that gets out as dust and vapor as they shatter. Most people just vacuum up the dust and broken glass without a thought, which is a great way of spreading the poison around your house. As a certified cleanup professional, I had both the training and the sworn duty to do the right thing in this situation, even if it kept me from going home for an extra hour. Kurt smirked at me, shaking his head as he pulled over his HEPA mask back on. "That's all you," he said, grabbing the shop vac and hollowing up the stairs. I followed him back to the van with a half-empty bucket solvent and fetched a sticky lint roller, a fine broom and dustpan, and a jar of intended for hazardous chemical waste. Kurt packed the rest of the equipment into the van while I performed the delicate duties of saving the world from 1,000th of a gram of mercury. Loading in and out were my least favorite parts of the job, and even though it was a Friday night, I didn't have much to go home to, so I was pretty slow at that. I timed it so I would finish just as there was nothing left but the lighting rig, and that was the only thing keeping my darkness at bay, for now the sun is gone. I swept the final flakes of CFL dust into the jar, then reached up to unscrew the wrecked light bulb space from the fixture. Just in time, I remembered to tug in the pull chain and switch it off first. I was sealing the jar's lid when I heard a snap of Kurt's Zippo. I was about to admonish him for smoking in the client's house when I saw he was using the light to get a look at something against a wall. Outside the sneering beam of the flood lamp, the better prepared cleaners carried a pin light with them, but Kurt was more of a travel light kind of guy. He was poking at some antique furniture that had witnessed in the basement's horrors and escaped unstained. It was a clean dough enough to sell them some deprived collector of serial killer memorabilia, which meant we weren't supposed to touch it. It's bad form from cleaner to snoop through the homeowner's property, but I guess the poor dead psycho wasn't going to mind. "Oops, looks like the cops have missed one," Kurt said, letting out an amused whistle as he stared into the drawer that he had opened, a direct confrontation from Clean Bro policy. "What?" I asked, not sure if I wanted to know. Kurt held up a severed finger in his interior gloved hand. giving me a glimpse of it before dropping into a small bag of biohazardous waste that he had already pulled from his pouch on his plastic bunny suit. I guess when the killer is dangling a few feet above the stack of his own victims, fluorescence guy, feel free to phone it in. Shaking off my mental image of the spare finger, I brought the jar of mercury kiss glass shards out to the van, securing it in a chest reserved for the deadliest of deadlies. I wasn't allowed to carry anything else when transporting something so very dangerous. You've got to love policies created solely for the corporate liabilities ass covering. I'd left Kurt behind, figuring that he could bring the lighting out when he was done collecting souvenirs. And he was taking his time, and I remember just now, unwillingly, the ring had been, and he had handed down to me. And after hanging at the van for a few seconds, I locked its doors. Another insane hazardous chemical waste policy, and went back down to the house to check on him. Descending to the basement one final time, I took a deep breath and drew in the smell of victory. Absolutely noticing then, like the killer who comes back for the one last swipe at the hero, a gust of putrid wind hit me in the face. I blinked away the tears from my eyes and had seen an odd shadow on the wall, tracing the outline of a tall, slender figure, its torso spread to the ceiling and its legs stretching across the floor, the whole shape swaying unnaturally. I was still reeling from the unexpected lungful of nauseous air, which was cleared by a chill draft blowing through the concrete room. My pulse quickened as my gaze swept across the space, scanning for some demonic intruder, but saw nothing there. Instead, I spotted a natural glove draped over one of the bulb enclosures of the lighting rig, 2 fingers dangling from the beam and fluttering slightly into the draft. The glove was just starting to melt in the searing Halligan stare, so I yanked it away before it glued itself to the metal frame. A red smear across the glove's palm turned out to be a massage. "Great, thanks," it said. "Kurt, what the fuck?" I yelled. Cleaners pranked each other all the time on the job, but this had crossed several lines. I scanned the shadows again, expecting to see him doubled over in surprised laughter, but I was alone. When I noticed the cool breeze was drifting down from the open bulkhead door open up the backyard. "How did you get that open?" I asked in the empty room, but no one reply came. "Come on, man," I whined, hoping Kurt would return to help me. After a few seconds of silence, I pulled out my tiny AA cell mag light and unplugged it into the halogen flood lamps, leaving myself standing in total darkness. I had the flashlight in my teeth as I hoisted the lighting rig with both my hands, wondering how I was going to get this piece of clean bro property back to the van without an adequate light or help. I was exactly afraid of the dark, but I did feel kind of vulnerable trying to haul that rig around the unit basement / murder factory, on cue and by imagination, or maybe it was my empty stomach, supplied a spooky noise which got me moving towards the shaft of the moonlight. Without help, hauling the lighting rig out of via the broad bulkhead door was easier than squeezing it up the kitchen staircase. And with the job done and no other working lights in the basement, I figured there was no point going back inside. I slammed the bulkhead shut and lugged at the rig around the front of the house, just in time to see Kurt's Civic backing down the driveway, pivoting and disappearing into the night. It was past our usual clean bro clock-out time, and my metallicious mercury cleanup procedure had probably made him late for a date with a bottle. I cursed his ass for leaving like that. I suddenly felt very alone, and I ascended the front steps one last time, locking the front door, and tucked the key into my lockbox hanging from the doorknob. There were no exterior lights on, and the neighborhood was sparse, mostly dark, finding it entirely too quiet. My imagination provided more Creepshow soundtrack, and in a moment I was back in the van, reversing up the drive to get a dangerous clip. Given how he left me like that, I was almost glad when Kurt no-showed for a free fire rehab job a couple days later. Instead, the office called a pretty pothead girl who was new to the cleaning game, and I was happy to show her the basics. Not that it's how not usual to work with a bunch of different cleaners over the course of the month. But a few weeks, I had noticed I hadn't seen Kurt since that basement job. He hardly seemed grossed out by it, so it didn't make sense that he would have just thrown in the towel like I'd seen many newbies did on their first death call. Usually, if you walk off the job, you walk off before you start, not after you're done. I started to wonder if Kurt seemed a little too happy with that particular cleanup. He had been more amused than disgusted by the finger he had found, and come to think of it, he didn't have to toss it in with the other bio-waste in the van, since I had the keys. The freak must have kept it, maybe even used it to write his fucked up glove note. I started to figure that either I'd witnessed the inspiration of the brand of new psychopath, or I'd been the sole guest at his retirement party. His 40-something burnout look didn't bear a passing resemblance to that police sketch. My suspicions grew when a couple months later, some detectives came to visit me about a fraud investigation centered on Kurt. They told me about something about closing his bank account the day after I'd last seen him. Something about maxing his credit cards buying easily pawned jewelry. Something about abandoning his car at the park on the other side of the state, and something about lack of friends or family question. Couldn't have been much cash, officer. Gold chains weren't Kurt's style. The detective. No idea where he could be hiding, sir. Maybe Kurt's a serial killer. I didn't suggest it. The house sat on the market for several more months through a few staggings and a few open houses, but thanks no small pass to my efforts. It sold to some family who needed room for all their kids and couldn't afford a place with a 0 body count in a good school district. I guess there is no such thing as ghosts, though. Maybe because I stuck around. I stuck around too. After I worked for a few more years at Cleanbro, they had got scandal with a few new crew cleaners who refused small jobs to case for burglaries and big jobs as their roving drug lab. It took a few cops long enough to figure out that by the time they were busted, everyone in the region knew somebody who had been burned by the Cleanbro bandits. The supply calls dropped off a cliff, and rather than wait for the axe to fall on me, one of their most reliable workers at that point, I used what I had learned in my community college business classes to put out my own shingle and built a solid, local brand doing the same shit as ever. I still had to put in that long hours and getting my hands dirty. A national corporate presence and a cushy executive office suit was still a long way off, but at least I was getting paid more than $9 an hour for my trouble. I actually started to like the work, watching the worst day of somebody's life vanish into a hefty bags or swirl down a drain. Business boomed, the town grew, and the woods were chopped down to build more suburban subdivisions and incorporated office parks. The whole thing with Kurt disappeared into my distant memory, never to be resolved. Like so many life's weird coincidences, that's when I fought for the past 2 decades anyway. A few weeks ago, I was sitting on my desk when I received an odd call, the kind where the homeowner doesn't want to give any details over the phone, just the address. A bashful caller, always a bad sign. I recognized the street name and decided to check out for myself before fobbing it off to one of the 20-year-old dropouts or 40-something burnouts that ride my payroll on their way from making whatever mistakes they're trying to outrun, those mistakes catching up with them. It was the same house where I last worked with Kurt, and after 2 decades of working in the region, I found it pretty easily. Even without my GPS-enabling smartphone, the neighbor had grown up around it, and with the new windows and a fresh coat of paint, you would never have guessed it what kind of place the serial killer had called it home. The current homeowner was the oldest child of the couple that had bought the house so many years ago. He was in his 30s now and had kids living on his own there. Most people had forgotten about the place's reputation, but something had come to light that would certainly jog folks' memories if it got out. He couldn't afford to dump the house and move, and he didn't want to stir up anything that would cause trouble for his kids at school or during the day. Poking around some old furniture that had been there for as long as he had. Thinking he turned the place into a cozy game room or some shit. He pushed aside the wardrobe from his spot against the concrete basement wall and revealed a steel door behind it, secured with a padlock. With a healthy curiosity and a pair of bolt cutters, he got it open without stopping to consider the basement's dark legacy until it was too late. A quick glimpse was enough to send him running to call the police. The cops found a mass grave there, sealed up airtight for more than a decade. By now, the coroner hauled off the bodies. The detectives had asked their questions for the dumbfounded owner, as well as his parents, siblings, wife, and the Forsyth's team had scraped out for a bunch of evidence, but they all seemed to be phoning it again. Mold spores and decaying patterns indicated that the small room had been sealed since before the family had moved in, and these were certainly the uncounted victims of the home's previous resident. Nobody wanted to face the embarrassment of having overlooked this much in their first time, and there was two funny things about it, though. If your sense of humor abide the stack of corpses entombed of what appeared to be now a cookie-cutter suburban development of smiling children and friendly dogs, most victims had been loaded dead and dismembered, but one on top of it had been hit in the head and sealed inside alive, left to suffocate on the stack of rotting bodies over the course of several hours. A fate surely worse than death. Followed by death, even stranger, the cell had contained an empty bucket of emergency rations that had once held enough packaged food to keep a person alive for almost half a year. The homeowner led me down to the basement where an unholy smell awakened some long-buried memories until the back of my head. The sense of smell said to have direct line to memory, and this stench had forced me to recall an entire day spent down here, mopping up the leavings of some psychopath's extended wet dream. Under the weak blush glare of the basement's bare lead bulb, the homeowner pointed out the shape of a wardrobe by the wall, and my heightened memory instantly recognized it. It was sitting just a few feet to the left of where it had been when Kurt and I had cleaned this place out. In its old spot, cut into the concrete wall, was there a steel door standing slightly ajar, wafting the stench of hell itself into the room. "Oh God, I'd forgotten how bad it was down here," the homeowner said, retreating to the kitchen and leaving me alone at the bottom of the few steps. A lengthy career of Soviet fumes and death cleanups had left me reasonably immune to the worst effects of bad smells, but I almost followed him anyway. God, I wish I had followed him and called in Braden or Malik to do my dirty work, but curiosity had gotten the best of me. I pulled out my heavy D-cell magnet from the loop in my utility belt, gripping it for safety against it. I don't fucking know what, and I walked over to the steel door. I checked out the wardrobe first, saving the worst for last. My mind flashed an image of Kurt pulling a severed finger out from one of its drawers with one hand, lit by the flickering glow of the lighter in his other. The wardrobe looked heavy with broad, solid feet, and probably would have taken 3 men team to pick up and move. Then I spotted the telltale tracks of the casters cut into 3 decades of dust that had fallen since Kurt and I cleaned the place last. Looking back, I realized that it had been no dust to speak when we started. After the house had been supposedly unoccupied for 6 months, I gave the wardrobe a nudge and it was clear. The hulking thing had hidden wheels so it would be slid around easily, and with no longer flush against the wall, I could even see a small handle bolted onto its back. I turned my attention to the steel door and now cut to the concrete wall. Standing about 4 feet tall in the corner, there was a brown smear. I recognized it as old blood, as if someone had hit it or been hit by it. A streak about a width of a fingertip had been smeared through it when it was flesh, but no real attempt had been made to clean it off. I inhaled deeply through my mouth, tasting that familiar reek, and held my breath. Then I pulled the handle. Inside was exactly what I imagined. A plenty caked on congealed, decaying blood, little bits of nondescript debris, coating the stone walls, floor, and the 4-square cell, but nothing that was still shocking after so long on the job. The space was tucked under the house's front door landing, an easily messed up prostern from the otherwise rectangular foundation. I leaned in with my flashlight and looked over for closer, certain that there was something to find, something to understand. Brown smudges on the wall could have been illegible writing, or feeble attempts to shift the stones. Someone had spent their last moments awake here and alive. There were final movements and a madman's sympathy, and something that was all I wanted to know. I let out a breath with a sigh and started to pull back, and that's when my 1,000 lumens of maglite brilliance caught something in the right corner of the concrete cell, tucked into the jamb of the door. Focused on my beam on it, taking a moment to resolve this soft-edged, rectangular shape and recognize it for what it was. It was an orange Zippo lighter. Its head singed with soot from the burning until it ran out of fuel. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Miss Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.